Colonel, I'd like to start with the hot news of the day, and that is the explosion of the Ukrainian dam. Obviously, there's a lot of theories as to what caused it, but let's watch the explosion and watch the water. We can actually talk over it. Can you tell where the explosion came from, Colonel?
Well, it's difficult to be certain, but based on the information that has begun to come out, it looks as though this happened within the dam structure. And more specifically, it may have something to do with the electrical works, the turbine inside. Whether this is the result of deliberate explosives or damage that occurred last year, no one knows. But more and more people are concluding that neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians deliberately destroyed this dam. And the concern at this point, from a military standpoint for the Ukrainians, is that it makes their operation much tougher because the flooded areas, specifically on the eastern side of the Dnieper, make it very, very difficult for their forces to move through these muddy areas. And obviously it makes an airborne, not necessarily an airborne, but a river-based assault almost impossible. The larger concern, though, is the nuclear power plant up in Zaporizhia.
And how does this water affect the nuclear power plant?
Well, just before I came on, my friend Chuck Spinney pointed out to me that there were concerns because we don't know if all the reactors are offline. The Russians and the Ukrainians tried to move most of the reactors offline. We think one may still be operating. Of course, water is used to cool the reactors. Will the drop in the water level in the river up near Zaporizhia have an impact on the availability of the water? We don't know, but that's a valid concern. A nuclear accident, of course, would be catastrophic.
Well, what do Ukrainians use that for? Power, ordinary power for business and for homes?
Well, they have, yes, of course. But once the war began and the Russians got control of it, they largely shut it down so that it would not be at risk of running out of control.
And what is the body of water from which all this spillage is coming?
Well, the Dnieper River, and they created a reservoir with the Dnieper River. In fact, the area that some of your viewers will be familiar with, where that used to be called the Cossack Sich. In other words, it was a Cossack Ukrainian state in the 1600s, was actually where the reservoir sits today. And they used to have an island in the Dnieper River, which was the center of it. All of that was flooded out by the Soviets, who were trying to harness it for power. And ultimately, they built a nuclear power plant there, which has provided important power for the entire state of Ukraine. Right now, it's very minimal, if at all. So the only concern we have is we just don't want to run out of water that is used to cool any of the reactors, assuming any of them are still online. We just don't.
I am fascinated with your conclusion from your own observations and from your sources that this is more likely than not explosions from within the dam and not intentional. My rather naive, or at least legal, as opposed to military way of looking at this was cui bono, to whose benefit. And I thought, well, the Ukrainians blew up their own dam in order to flood the lands to prevent the Russians from moving across those lands. And I'm happy that you corrected me. Has anybody taken credit for this?
No, I think there's been a lot of finger pointing. The Ukrainians, of course, blame everything on the Russians. If the sun comes up 2 minutes late tomorrow morning, the Russians are responsible. The Russians didn't do it. That's obvious. There's just no incentive for them to do that. They could have done it months ago had they wanted to do that. And I don't think the Ukrainians wanted this because it's obvious that they've been assembling some amphibious forces for potential use behind the Russian defensive lines. That's now out of the question. You're not going to have a water level high enough to support it. And then when you get out of the little bitty rubber boats that they use, you have to walk through very, very muddy terrain. So you're just a target. So no, if anybody did benefit accidentally, I suppose you could make the argument that the Russians did somewhat, simply because instead of a 900-mile defensive line, they're now looking at an 800 and 870-mile or 875-mile defensive line because the areas are so muddy and flooded on their left flank that nobody can get through there anyway.
So if someone looked at the explosion and said the offensive has begun, the contrary is true. The flooding of the dam probably, correct me if I'm wrong, Colonel, impeded the imminence of the spring offensive.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to assume. And again, when we talk about the offensive, if I could just digress for 1 second.
Sure.
If we look over the weekend at the three major attacks along this 900-mile front, the largest being down near Zaporizhzhia, these attacks were disasters for the Ukrainians. They lost almost 4,000 men, killed and wounded, 54 tanks, 210 armored personnel carriers, 134 trucks, several jet fighters, 2 helicopters. The Russians, by comparison, had 71 men killed and 210 wounded. And, of course, their defensive lines are intact. So I think all they managed to do over the weekend was confirm what we've been saying from the beginning, which is this defense is tightly integrated, and any attempt to move into it and attack it is going to result in massive losses. So the question is, if they were just probing attacks and there is still yet an offensive to come, what's it going to look like?
Right.
God, I don't know.
Colonel, is Ukraine falling apart?
Yes, absolutely. Morale is in the basement, the cellar, if you will. It's very tragic. The military leadership over there knows it. They're frantic. The question is not what happens after the so-called counteroffensive fails, so much as it is Ukraine got anything left at all at that point. And as if the Russians move, and I suspect they will, they're just going to overrun most of the area east of the Dnieper and eventually cross the bridge up at Zaporizhzhia or at any number of places and move south to Odessa.
Here's a video prepared by the Ukrainian government. Now, I know we're going to talk about D-Day in a few minutes.
Yeah.
Somehow I can't imagine Eisenhower having done this, but here's a video prepared by the Ukrainian government sort of announcing and warning. And please, Colonel, pay careful attention to the very end, which is different from the first 3 quarters of this.
Okay.
Plan like silence. There will be no announcement that it has started. There you go. What were those jets at the end, Colonel?
I don't know. I didn't recognize them, frankly.
You didn't recognize them as American F-16s. I'm not saying they are. I'm just trying to figure out. It's very different from the rest, and it would seem to implicate that the spring offensive, in quotes, is going to be an invasion of Russia.
I suppose, we could add our aircraft to their arsenal, but then you're running the risk of being at war with Russia, which I don't think even this administration at this stage wants to risk. The rest of it, I'm sure there are Ukrainian commanders in the field that are asking where those troops are and why he can't have them.
Why they're in front of cameras with their fingers on their lips. I mean, what does this accomplish, if anything?
It's inconceivable to me what they expected to accomplish other than to send the message that somehow or another they're more ready and capable than they are. I mean, those people were all beautifully uniformed. None of them looked like they'd been in combat for any length of time. They were all extremely well fed. Normally, if you've been in combat for any length of time, you've lost weight. Your uniform is worn out. You don't look pristine for the camera by any stretch of the imagination. Even the small arms that were depicted there and the equipment, it's all brand new, clean equipment. So maybe these are obviously not part of the equipment that included 54 tanks destroyed, including some unknown number of Leopard tanks, by the way. They were part of the assault that were destroyed.
Colonel, is is the Russian army having difficulty gaining control of even the areas of Ukraine that President Putin and the Russian Federation have claimed for years are legally parts of Russia?
No, I haven't seen any evidence for that. I mean, the areas they've claimed and incorporated are under control. There are no fifth columnists blowing things up now. They have been penetrated, as we've discussed before. I think the SAS was responsible for the attack on the bridge to Crimea. They may have done some other things, but no, I don't see any evidence.
SAS is British?
Yeah, the British Special Air Service. That's the equivalent of what we would call Special Operations Forces. And they're very, very good. There's no question about it. And it's very risky to send them behind the lines like that, but they appear to have done it. They may have had a hand, by the way, in the recent drone attacks on Moscow.
Can the attacks on Russia, inside Russia, alter the course of this conflict?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you're talking about pinpricks. You know, these are just because you manage to get off a lucky shot and kill one person isn't going to change the outcome if you're fighting an entire company of infantry. Well, the same analogy holds for, you're fighting Russia. If anything, it reinforces and reaffirms in the minds of the Russian people the criticality of getting on with this thing and crushing the Ukrainians. I mean, as I've said before, President Putin is the one who's exercised enormous restraint. It would be very easy for him to go before the camera and emote about what had happened and how it threatened the motherland and so forth and justify massive attacks on Ukraine. He didn't do that. He essentially dismissed them and then pointed out that they would continue their strikes in the future.